Thomas Jefferson was, of course, a key founding father of the United States, a man who authored the Declaration of Independence, a document that freed more people than any other political document in the history of the world. But alongside that legacy is a more complicated history tied to race, including more than 600 people he enslaved throughout his life. New York Times bestselling author and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Annette Gordon-Reed is taking a closer look at that contradiction. Her new book, titled Jefferson on Race, brings together the third president's personal and public writings on the topic of Black Americans, Native Americans, and slavery, and how those views intersect with the ideals Jefferson helped set during the nation's founding. And Annette joins us now. She's a professor of history and law at Harvard University. Annette, thank you so much for being back with us. This is just an extraordinary work about an extraordinarily complicated man. And as you lay out there, and we did in the intro, about the Declaration of Independence, he saw himself as a liberal on issues of race, and others did during his time. And yet, as you say, slavery bounded his entire life. He owned 610 slaves. How do you walk readers through those contradictions in this book? And where did you come out after all these years studying Jefferson? Where did you come out at the end of this book? What were your new thoughts on Jefferson?
Well, I walk the reader through it by dividing the book into three sections, talking about his self-image. As you said, he thought of himself as a progressive person and what today would be considered a liberal person, a man of the Enlightenment, forward-thinking, thinking that, the world was patterned on science, that eventually you would get new discoveries and the world would change. So I talk about his self-image, and then I talk about his theories, the things that he writes specifically about race, and then finally end up with a section about his actions. And so you're able to see, going through those three things, just the kinds of contradictions that you're talking about, but it ends up to being a very, very human portrait, I think. I mean, it invites you to think about ourselves and the kinds of things that we say we believe, but then when we have the opportunity to actually live that, we don't. And I think he did that very, very much, but he did it sort of on a larger scale, obviously, with the institution of slavery and being president and all the ways he had the chance to do something about it, but didn't. But I think it ends up asking us, inviting us to ask about ourselves. What do we think that we feel about certain things, and then when we have the moment to do something about it, and we don't.
I read an interview you talking about Jefferson writing things down, so many things down, which separated him from other founders, and he looked ahead to the coming conflict on race. He knew that it was inevitable. But you said there was a certain danger to writing things down. It just reminds me of the contrast with Lincoln, who wrote almost nothing down regarding his self-reflections outside of speeches and government documents. But talk about Jefferson's writings and how it helps you as a historian and helps others to better understand the contradictions, while thousands of books are written about Abraham Lincoln and people are just trying to project their own beliefs, their own feelings onto Lincoln.
Well, he really wanted to shape his legacy. I mean, he understood that by creating the United States of America, he had done something. He had helped, not single-handedly, he had done something that would change the world, and it would be an example to the world. And he fully expected to be somebody that we would be sitting, on a Monday morning talking about, and lo these many years. And so he wanted to shape his legacy. And so even though he did not live up to the ideals that the Declaration put forth, I think he understood that one day those ideals would be something that would be the world over. And he wanted to be on the good side of history. He actually thought that there was a good side of history. I'm not so sure about that. I think history is just what unfolds. But he thought that there would be improvements throughout society, and he wanted us to think of him as somebody who put those things in motion. So in a way, we have his understanding of where he wants to go in a way that you might not for Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln in his speeches obviously telegraphs what his values are, but not as much in the, as you said, in the kind of personal musings about these things. But Jefferson is trying to direct us to see him as the kind of man he wanted to be seen as, even though if you look at other aspects of his life, you realize, well, if you really believe that, then there are these things that you could do. And he was not able to make himself do that. Monticello, I know you've been to Monticello, it was a comfortable place for him. His lifestyle was comfortable for him, and he was not going to give that up.
You say, it's fascinating, you say that Jefferson, if the country was fine with it, that Jefferson would likely be fine with black Americans taking leadership roles, but he would be baffled by women as governors, baffled by women as military officers. Explain that difference. Well,
I think he thought that, well, I know he thought that the differences between men and women were natural, and that each of the sexes had their particular place. And he did not think that women's place was outside of the home. Women were not supposed to be involved in politics. He thought that women found their equality by taking care of families, essentially, or being part of the family. He understood that African-American men, or believed that men, not African-American men, but African men were leaders, that men were the natural leaders in society, and that's what he would have thought of as something that would continue throughout history. I mean, he educated his granddaughters, strangely enough, in ways that were the kinds of education that men would get, but that was primarily to be able to teach their children. So he thought that there were separate spheres for male and female. He believed that there's no question, he ventured it as a suspicion only. He said that African Americans were inferior to whites, but I think mentally inferior. I think he actually believed that. I don't think it was a suspicion. He just knew he wasn't supposed to say that outright and felt uncomfortable doing it. But I think he was less sure about that than he was about sure about the differences between men and women.
So clearly, Jefferson was an extraordinary human being and a futurist. I mean, he saw in his own mind and wrote down what he saw as the Declaration of Independence, saw the future, what he wanted the future to be. But was he also a racist?
Well, yes, he was racist in the sense that that was white supremacy was the order of the day. There's no question about that. And
did he feel any guilt about it?
Guilt about racism? He expressed reticence in the way that people who consider themselves very often liberal to say that I'm not going to admit straight out that I feel these ways. So there was a reticence there, but there's no question in mind that he had the racial views of his community at the time. And there was a feeling, and certainly slavery enhanced that, a sort of a racial hierarchy that he was a part of and he was the top of.
Chris Matthews, take the next question.
You know, you have to ask about what he thought about men and women, and you've done a great job so far here. But women, how do you explain bringing Sally Hemings over to Paris with him? In France, they didn't recognize slavery. She was not a slave when she was over there. Then he brought her back, and she was a slave again. How did he put all that together?
Well, he put it together because that's what he wanted to do. He would have thought that, well, she goes over after he's there and wants to stay there because, as you said, she would have been free there, and he persuades her to come back, saying you'll have a nice life here and the children we have will be freed. But he would have thought that that was a natural thing. I mean, he constructed in this very paternalistic way the institution of slavery as a family situation. Her family was at home, and I'm sure that he probably persuaded her, or she thought herself, that better to be in this institution with my family than to be by myself. That's the dilemma that lots of African Americans felt during that time period. Do you take your freedom on your own, or do you face this situation with your mother and your father and your siblings? And lots of people made the choice to with their family. So he could take advantage of that.
We will continue this conversation. The new book, Jefferson on Race, is out now. Annette Gordon-Reed, thank you so much, Annette. We'll be back again tomorrow to talk more about this book. Thanks for being on this morning. And Chris Matthews, thank you as well.